join us today and just have a few housekeeping announcements before we begin. Please note this webinar does not provide CME credits. The information presented here today can be accessed on ASAM's website, which will be reviewed during the webinar. A recording of this webinar will be posted to the ASAM e-learning center within 30 days. You will be able to access the recording free of charge, and to view the recording, please log in to the e-learning center. If you have any questions during the webinar, please submit them in the questions box. Your questions will be answered during the Q&A portion of the webinar. Next, I'd like to introduce our speakers today, Dr. Lawrence S. Brown Jr. and Dr. Margaret A. Jarvis. Dr. Brown received a combined MD from the New York University School of Medicine and a Master's in Public Health from the Columbia University School of Public Health. He is currently the Chief Executive Officer at START Treatment and Recovery Centers in Brooklyn, New York. A former president of the American Society of Addiction Medicine, Dr. Brown has served on the committees of the Food and Drug Administration, the National Institute on Drug Abuse, and the National Institute on Allergy and Infectious Diseases. Dr. Brown's scientific contributions have focused upon the sequelae of addiction and improving treatment of substance use disorders, resulting in over 100 peer-reviewed articles, chapters, and published abstracts reflecting investigator-initiated and collaborative research sponsored by NIDA, NIAID, and private industry. Dr. Brown also serves as medical advisor to the National Football League. Welcome, Dr. Brown. Dr. Jarvis finished her medical school, psychiatry residency, and addiction medicine fellowship at the Medical College of Virginia in Richmond. Dr. Jarvis is the medical director at Marworth in Waverly, Pennsylvania, which is the residential addiction treatment center for the Geisinger Health System. She has been in this position since 1999. She is also clinical assistant professor of psychiatry at the Penn State University College of Medicine in Hershey, Pennsylvania. Dr. Jarvis currently serves as the treasurer of the board of Marley's Mission, a nonprofit that provides equine-assisted psychotherapy to abused children in the Scranton, Pennsylvania area. Welcome, Dr. Jarvis. Next slide, please. Here are the disclosures for our speakers today. Dr. Brown has nothing to disclose, and Dr. Jarvis' disclosures are listed here. If you would like more information on the disclosures listed, please contact ASAM's Quality and Improvement Department. I will now turn this over to Dr. Jarvis.
Thank you for having me here. I'm very glad to have the opportunity to discuss this publication. ASAM undertook this project starting approximately a year and a half ago because there is no universal standard for drug testing in clinical addiction medicine. As a result, there have been a great variety in how people practice using drug testing in this field, and sometimes that has resulted in poor quality care for patients who have or are at risk for addiction. Because of this, ASAM determined that we would create such a document. There were also a number of members of ASAM that had contacted the organization to say, we need something. We need something that defines when drug testing is done appropriately, under what circumstances, and what kind of testing needs to be done. Part of the need for this was so that this document could say, here's what's necessary, and we don't want our practitioners and their patients facing undue restrictions in the use of this particular tool, whether that's from arbitrary limits based on reimbursement or regulations. We don't want for there to be interference in the patient-physician relationship. So in January of 2016, the ASAM Board of Directors approved the beginning of this project. Next slide, please. The scope of the project is intended to answer the question of how to appropriately use drug testing, specifically for addiction specialists and any other providers who are using drug testing to identify, diagnose, treat, or monitor patients who have or are at risk for addictive disease. There will be other clinicians who find this document useful, particularly in the care of certain populations of patients, adolescents, pregnant women, people who are in recovery, and healthcare and other licensed professionals. The decision was made by the ASAM board to specifically exclude recommendations around workplace drug testing, forensic drug testing, because those situations are regulated by SAMHSA. Also specifically excluded is drug testing in the context of criminal justice and pain management. Next slide, please. The process of creating this document is that the organization ASAM contracts with another organization to help in developing the document. In this case, we were fortunate enough to work with the Institute for Research, Education, and Training in the Addictions. There is a particular methodology that the Quality Improvement Council of ASAM has selected in the creation of these kinds of documents, and that is the RAND-RAM appropriateness method. This combines what scientific evidence exists with clinical expertise to develop recommendations for appropriate practice. And this is a particularly useful methodology for situations where there may not be as robust a scientific literature as one might wish. And in the case of drug testing, that is in fact the situation. Once the document was created, an external review took place, and a number of different individuals and organizations were asked to comment. These included ASAM members, addiction-related organizations, payers, federal stakeholders, medical organizations, patient organizations, as well as individual experts. The feedback was gathered, and ASAM and IRETA reviewed the feedback and incorporated those comments that we believed would enhance the document. The final document was approved by the ASAM board on April 5th of this year. And now I will turn it over to Dr. Brown.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jarvis. And I also would like to thank ASAM and thank you, Dr. Jarvis, for your leadership in this endeavor, and thank those of you who are listening to this very important press conference. To emphasize again, the purpose of this document is to have a consensus document that identifies the current clinical practice and disagreement in some cases regarding the use of drug testing, and compiling recommendations in a comprehensive document for the use by a variety of providers who utilize drug testing. In so doing, the document provides a universal standard for drug testing and clinical addiction medicine, and provides guidance on the effective use of drug testing in the identification, the diagnosis, treatment, and monitoring of patients with or at risk for addiction. The bottom line is that the purpose of this document is to improve the quality of care for patients with substance use disorders. Next slide, please. The dramatic proliferation of potentially addictive drugs is one of the challenging problems facing society and drug testing today. The inappropriate use of drug testing is both wasteful and unethical. Examples include the routine use of large arbitrary test panels, or unnecessarily frequent drug testing without consideration for the drug's windows of detection. And another important reason why this is really so important is that the confirmation and quantification of all presumptive positive and negative test results really require an attention to detail and training that is not like what we see in other areas of healthcare. Unlike clinical practice guidelines, which typically focus on disease-specific treatment recommendations, this document focuses on recommendations for where, when, and how drug testing should be performed. Recommendations in this document are not intended to substitute for independent clinical judgment based upon the particular facts and circumstances presented by individual patients to their care providers. In circumstances in which the document is being used as a basis for regulatory or payer decisions, improvement in quality care should always be the goal. Next slide, please. It's important to share with you that there are a number of derivative products from this fantastic work by my colleagues. One is the journal article, the American Society of Addiction and Medicine published an article in the Journal of Addiction Medicine that describes the rationale and process for creating this document and summarizes the recommendations. And I do recommend very strongly to everyone to take a look at the article because you'll get some more context that we are not able to provide in such a short, brief press conference. Number two is that the journal also agreed to provide a supplement. ASAM published this full document as a supplement to the journal article in the same issue in which the consensus document was published. Additionally, the ASAM created a pocket guide to serve as a quick reference tool to offer healthcare providers instant access to key information of the document in a clear and concise format. And because of this, and in the age of technology, there is also a digital app. The pocket guide is available in such a form to be used using technology. Infographics are also available with the Institute of on Research and Education, Training and Addictions. They created a set of infographics for educational and marketing purposes. Please consult ASAM's website for this information. Next slide, please. The next steps here for this, as we see it, is that there is going to be a partner toolkit. ASAM has created this toolkit for organizations to be able to share the messages about the document on their social media platforms, such as Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn. The toolkit has sample messages, suggested uses, and website and email banners to incorporate in any communications. The toolkit can also be accessed using ASAM's website. There will be a CME webinars that ASAM is intending to conduct these webinars on drug testing consensus document. The first CME webinar will be offered on Wednesday, July 19th at 12 noon Eastern Standard Time. Please again consult the ASAM website to learn more and to register. Finally, and not the least of which, is that for media inquiries, please contact Erin Foxworthy, our coordinator and marketing content and staff editor. The content information is also provided by virtue of the website of ASAM. Again, this has been a unique honor for me, and with that, I'm turning it back over to my leader, Dr. Jarvis.
At this point in time, do we have questions that we could answer?
Dr. Jarvis, our first question is, how many CME webinars will there be in total, and when do you anticipate on having them?
So there will be 3 in total at least. The first one, as Dr. Brown mentioned, will be next week, and monthly thereafter for several months.
Our next question is, what have been some of the effects of not having a universal standard of drug testing?
Well, unfortunately, one of the significant things that has happened in the last several years is, frankly, fraudulent behavior where patients have been very poorly served and insurance companies and other sources of payment have been taken advantage of in situations where, as Dr. Brown had mentioned, those extended panels of drug testing done so frequently that it didn't make sense in terms of the human physiology. Those things have occurred, and one of the things we had hoped to address with this particular guide is having some suggestions about how to not have that happen.
Our next question is, why was pain management excluded from the intended audience?
Dr. Brown, did you want to take a question?
That is a question that admittedly is we anticipated. And one of the reasons why we anticipated is that to share with the public that while there may appear to be some overlap between pain treatments, particularly given the fact that the risk for development of addiction, and the actual body of medicine called addiction medicine, there were enough unique components of it that we felt it was important to address specifically the addiction medicine aspects, because we did not want to have the impression that we were giving guidance with respect to treating pain. We are cognizant of the fact that, yes, again, there's some degree of overlap, but we wanted to concentrate here on addiction medicine itself. And there has been some conversation about, you might say, part two, where there would be some later addressing of the way in which they overlap. But it's important that for some medications, for example, the same medication in treating for pain is different than the treating of that using that same medicine for addiction. And very briefly, for example, the medication methadone can be used for the treatment of pain and can be used for the treatment of addiction, in which, depending on which sphere you happen to be in, the clinical guidance is very different. So for that, as an example of one reason why we separated the two.
Our next question, do you anticipate this document being used by family physicians and internalists who may be attempting to identify or monitor patients who have substance use disorders?
I'd be happy to answer that, and the question is a resounding yes. We certainly would hope that this document would be used not only by specialists, but by people who are not specialists, who are making the effort to learn how to take better care of the patients that they see who have addiction. Virtually every primary care doctor who may not have set out to treat addiction is going to see addiction, and virtually every primary care doctor is going to have a certain percentage of the patient panel they see who will end up with addictive problems. And so we would absolutely hope that those doctors would take advantage of this document to help them in giving good care to those patients.
If I might add an additional comment on this question, I agree that this is important, and if you recall, we mentioned in my comments that this is meant to a way to help to identify, and that identification generally for most areas of healthcare begins with the primary care physician. Admittedly, like in other areas of healthcare, a biological tool like drug testing is used by both the generalists and the specialists, recognizing that from time to time the specialist, in this case the addiction medicine doc, may need to be called into the conversation based on the result that the generalist may obtain in a given patient circumstance. There's another reason for this, is that there is oftentimes an underestimation with respect to the role that untreated addiction may play in the treating of other chronic diseases such as hypertension or diabetes. An untreated addiction can very well make it such that the patient and the doctor may not achieve the desirable clinical outcomes for the diabetes or hypertension.
Our next question, can we publish the document in our organization's online resource center?
So we do not, ASAM does not allow the hosting of a document on alternative websites. However, ASAM can provide links that could be placed on somebody else's website to send members who are interested in this to the document.
Next question, has the fraudulent behavior concerning drug testing you mentioned been limited to one area of the country, or has it been seen in many areas?
Regrettably, if I can, Dr. Jarvis, regrettably,
Please do.
So that's something for which we as clinicians often see, but admittedly is not sufficiently reported to be able to say we can go to one data source or another. We will find in all parts of the country questions are on mind about how long it'll take for a patient to come to be receiving care by us. And oftentimes it's not because of the intentional efforts, although sometimes those can be defined as being fraudulent, but sometimes it's because of the lack of knowledge about how to use the test, under what circumstances. And quite frankly, sometimes providers are driven by payers who may not entirely appreciate the uniqueness of this important tool. So the behaviors that we've seen in terms of inappropriate use are not limited to any particular part of the country. And in fact, what we're finding across the United States, the prescription drug issues are in fact covering all parts of the country, and the states are responding based on what they view are in the best interest of their constituents.
Next question, should patients who are stable on buprenorphine still be tested regularly?
So the recommendation in this document is that yes, they should be, but as a person, as a patient evidences stability, that testing can be moved further and further apart. Just as a patient who might get stabilized on medications for diabetes would not necessarily need to have a blood sugar taken every day anymore. That testing might be moved to less frequent intervals.
Next question. In a nutshell, could you describe a situation in which a primary care physician would first approach a patient about testing for drugs of abuse? Wouldn't the patient have to give consent? That is, a doctor couldn't just test because he or she suspects the patient is misusing or abusing.
Dr. Brown, do you want to take that?
I'd be happy to. So it's important that this consensus document was meant to look at drug testing as a clinical tool. So with all clinical tools, there needs to be a conversation, a therapeutic alliance, if you will, between the patient and the provider. At all times, the provider must disclose and share with the patient about any type of biological test, including drug testing, that may be considered. And for me, as an addiction medicine specialist, I make it clear that this is meant to, in fact, begin or cement the relationship between the provider and the patient. There are sometimes patients may not realize that some of their behaviors may be reflected in a biological test. And the idea here is to not punishment, but rather to begin to have the conversation And if the patient refuses, the clinician needs to know that this means that maybe not at this particular setting, but continue the discussion because over time there may be a greater understanding about the value. Because sometimes patients come to clinicians for reasons that, quite frankly, that are not for clinical, but because they have to do something for their job or they have to do something for their healthcare plan. Physicians have a unique role to say to them, listen, to what extent this is a clinical need, then I'm here to be your advocate. For other reasons, we have to tell you about the limitations about the use of this tool. So yes, this needs to be a voluntary, a collaboration between patient and providers. This is not something that we would recommend that be done without patient consent, because if you do that, then you undermine the benefit of doing this test in the first place.
Our next question, how is drug testing used differently in different settings and for special populations?
So depending on the setting, depending on the particular patients, there are going to be different needs. So for instance, in a residential treatment facility where patients are housed under one roof for a number of days at a time, it would be appropriate that the patients might receive an initial drug test and then may not have another drug test for some period of time. And that's because there's constant supervision and accountability through other measures. Now, if that same patient were being treated in the initial parts of drug and alcohol treatment, if that same patient were being treated on an outpatient basis, it would be important to be testing fairly frequently, once a week, for instance, because the same level of supervision is not available. Different populations have different risk factors for risky drug use. So patients who perhaps have just initiated addiction treatment are going to be having drug testing fairly frequently, whereas those who perhaps have had long-standing recovery are not going to need to be tested that frequently at all. Patients who perhaps are just leaving a very sheltered, contained environment, such as a criminal justice facility, may need to be tested a bit more frequently, even though they may have been abstinent for a period of time, because that time in which they have gone from being in jail or prison to out in the world presents a lot of new risks for the person who has addiction. And just that change in environment would put them at risk to pick up drugs or alcohol again. So there needs to be some thought about the particular patient and the stresses, the resources, the risks that face them.
And if I might add an example from outside of addiction, let's take a case in which a primary care doctor is seeing a patient and the patient gives a history of having a sports injury, and that sports injury was treated with hydrocodone. The primary care physician might very well ask the patient, are you continuing to use the medication? The patient may say sparingly. The primary care physician may say, well, let's see whether or not this medication is still in your system in the same way, in the manner in which you have shared with me, because maybe that's something we might be able to address together. So here's an example, and what I would think in a non-confrontational way, that you build a therapeutic alliance outside of an addiction treatment setting where clinical drug testing may be useful. And that is one of the reasons for this consensus document, to allow the primary care docs to consider using it in circumstances that are reasonably well defined that are not confrontational.
Next question. What have addiction specialists used until now to guide them in terms of who, when, and how to test?
So in the past, I think each one of us have learned a fair bit about particularly the science of the methods of drug testing, how the various tests are performed, how the body metabolizes different drugs and alcohol, and that has been a large part of the education of addiction specialists. Armed with that information, I believe that we have all adopted our own ways of doing things. And while many of us have very similar ways of doing things, it's not universal. And that's part of the utility of a document like this, is that even with those of us who have done this work for many, many years, there's such variety in practice that it's hard to know what's best practice. It's hard to gather data if one were to, for instance, mine an electronic health record to look for information, because the practices have been fairly inconsistent.
Next question. How can repeated positive drug tests be addressed in a therapeutic and non-punitive manner?
So that's often a question that we receive, and I oftentimes like to have my colleagues also think about other chronic potentially relapsing disorders. For example, again, we've been talking about diabetes. It's important that, similar to how one would treat a patient with another chronic potential relapsing disorder, again like diabetes, that there continues to be increasing the relationship and the frequency of the discussion to try to identify the factors that are associated with the biological findings. Now, it's important that even though we've been talking about drug testing, we're very clear that this is not the only piece of information that is gathered from the doctor-patient relationship. So the information from this has to be reviewed in the context of information that you get with respect to the patient's history, what they share with you, information that you get from other tests that are occurring. So these have to always continuously be reevaluated, because not every session is with the patient is going to be cookie cutter. It's going to always be something that is different, for which there is some merit to consider the whys and what to do based on what you've come together to say, this makes sense.
Next question. In terms of the external review process, were all of the external comments weighted equally?
Yes, they were. A number of us sat down together and went through all of the comments and looked at which ones we thought added something useful to the document, and those were all incorporated, regardless of who had written them.
Next question. Are all of the materials in the product suite free of charge?
So, Dr. Brown, do you want to take that one?
I'd be happy to.
Okay.
All the digital versions of the product suite are certainly free. However, if you're interested in the hard copies of material, such as the document, journal article, or Parker Guide, there is a small fee. And for information about that, please, again, consult the ASAM website.
Next question. Access to the Journal of Addiction Medicine is usually members only. Do I need to be a member to view the document?
For this particular situation, no. The consensus document and the journal article are open access.
Thank you, Dr. Jarvis and Dr. Brown. That's all the questions that we have for today. And thank you as well for your expert insight. Thank you, everyone, for attending the ASAM Appropriate Use of Drug Testing in Clinical Medicine. Dr. Jarvis, did you have something you wanted to add?
No, I'm just grateful for everybody being here.
Thank you. And please visit the ASAM website for more information and resources. The first drug testing CME webinar will take place next week on July 19th from 12 o'clock p.m. to 1 o'clock p.m. Eastern Standard Time. If you have any other questions, please submit them to ASAM guideline at asam.org. We hope to see you on July 19th. Thank you.